Hello, and welcome to Working Historians, a podcast series where we discuss what historians do with their lives. I am Rob Denning, Associate Dean for Liberal Arts for Southern New Hampshire University's online history programs. Today's episode is a recording of another event in the Southern New Hampshire University History Speaker Series, which brings together professional historians, students, faculty, and staff to talk about research projects, new publications, and history-related careers. At this event, Dr. Roger Newman joins me and my intrepid pal Jimmy Fennessy to discuss his forays into historical fiction and his recently published book, Boys. Check it out. Tonight in this History Speaker Series event, we have Roger Newman. Dr. Newman is a professor of obstetrics and gynecology, specializing in the care of women with multiple gestations, and is the author of hundreds of publications, including scientific papers, medical thrillers, and of utmost interest to us here tonight, historical fiction. His previous novels include Occam's Razor, Two Drifters, and What Becomes, which are all medical thrillers, and Will o' the Wisp, Madness, War, and Recompense, which is historical fiction. His most recent book of historical fiction, Boys, won the Nautilus Book Award Gold Medal for Best Personal Journey or Memoir, the Next Generation Indie Book Award Gold Medals for Historical Fiction, Southern Fiction, and Military Fiction, and the Cover Crush Magazine Gold Medal for Best Cover Art in an Independently Published Book. So the book seems to be very well received. I'm looking forward to talking about that tonight. So thank you for coming to join us, Dr. Newman.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's exciting to be involved in a educational forum. Haven't had that opportunity.
Yeah, we're looking forward to that. It's so first off, why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself beyond what I just read off in the bio there? But tell us about your background. How do you what have you done with your life, I guess, and what brings you to doing historical fiction?
Well, my father was military, so I grew up traveling around. We lived from military base to military base when I was a kid, and then he retired in 1968, and we moved to Columbia, South Carolina. That period of time, and Columbia is featured in the book. But I grew up, went to high school in South Carolina. Went off to college at Seton Hall University. Every time I see a SNHU commercial on TV, I always have to look twice because I think it's a SHU commercial. Majored in biology, came back to South Carolina to go to medical school, did my residency in OBGYN there. Then I went to San Francisco for a couple of years to do a fellowship in high-risk obstetrics. Then I came back to Charleston, to the medical university where I've practiced my entire career. And that career, I still work part-time, but it began to wind down about 2015, the last child kind of moved out of the house and we became empty nesters, and I cut back on some of my clinical duties, so I was more of a part-time, and I'd always wanted to write. I had over the years collected some stories in my head that I thought would make good novels, and started writing in 2014. And as you mentioned, my first three books were medical thrillers, and with kind of the same character carried through. And then I decided that what I really enjoyed when I was reading, I love historical fiction. So that's when I decided to start Will o' the Wisp, and after that one, Boys, which would both fall into that historical fiction category.
So talking about inspiration, is it kind of a chicken and the egg? Which came first, the story idea, and then you embedded it into an historical period, or were you inspired by a certain period in history and then you put the narrative and the fictitious story on top of it, or did they just kind of develop naturally together?
They were both of the stories that I became attracted to were set in the time period where I set the novel. Will o' the Wisp is about a blockade runner during the Civil War based in Charleston, and he was a distant relative of my wife. My wife's very into ancestry, as many people are. So I learned Captain John Whitesides Holmes. So I learned about him and what he did during the Civil War. And he was a shipbuilder and a highly successful blockade runner. So then I took that and built, a fictional drama around it. And the same with boys. I had to make things fair. So boys has to do with my father's side of the family, and it really is based on a family, my family history, where my grandfather took in a black boy they found hiding in their barn who'd been orphaned. His family had been killed by the Klan, and they took him in. My grandfather was no particularly virtuous soul. He was only a couple generations removed from the Civil War, and he had no particular affection at all for black people, but he ran a dairy farm that was family run, and he wanted another worker. So he told Alex that he could stay if he worked. And to the rest of the family, Alex was just another farmhand, but he was the same age as my father, and they became very close. And from my father conversations, he considered Alex his brother. So I thought that was kind of an amazing scenario and story, set in the Great Depression and the deep Jim Crow South, in a small rural North Carolina town. And Alex and my father went off to World War II together. They got off the farm as soon as they had the chance to do it, and they became separated during the war because the Army in World War II was segregated. And my father never heard from Alex again. So that was kind of the end of the factual part of the story that I knew. And then I had to build the fictional story around those two characters. So I bring them back together in a pretty significant battle during World War II, and then I have them come back together again in the late 60s during the civil rights and anti-war era in the South, in the whole country, actually. So long answer to your question, I at least for these two books and what I'm thinking about for the next book is based on some real people in what I think are fascinating circumstances. And then, you have to build the characters and build the drama around them to make it interesting to people to read.
It's interesting because the book is labeled as excuse me. The book is labeled as a novel. As we mentioned, you won an award for personal journey / memoir, and you're saying this is based on real characters. So it's interesting. So basically, for our purposes here, you had an actual historical story to tell, and at least these two kids growing up together. And then, but then you say they went off to war. One of them was never seen again. Presumably, he died. Do we know?
My father never knew, because we didn't have don't have the ability to research things the way we do now. It turns out he was not killed. We found a obituary for him in Washington, D.C. in the mid-1950s. So he returned from the war, had a job at the U.S. Mint and worked there. We don't really know anything else about his life, but we know that he did make it back from the war and died in the 50s, which would have made him pretty young. So don't know what happened to him. But my dad never knew. He never knew.
Interesting. Yeah, and so the fiction part of it, I suppose, is from kind of carrying on from that point forward. Since in your story, like you said, they met up again in the war, and then there was some stuff that happened after the war.
Yeah,
Um,
much of the part of the after they go to the army, um, it's kind of the middle section of the book. That's based on what I learned about what my father did during during the war. And like many men from that era, he didn't talk about the war at all. So I really knew very little about his involvement in World War II, other than he'd won several medals. So searching through the citations for the medals and the battle in which he won those medals, I was able to again pull forward some pretty interesting history about what was called the Battle of Mortain, and include that in the book.
And when it came to the historical elements, like the battle or the things that you weave in around the civil rights movement, do you feel that you were the historical information and the historical setting was enough to really keep the interest and drive the overall narrative, or did you have to do any kind of did you play fast and loose with any of the historical facts in order to kind of to feed into the narrative?
The both. The details regarding the Battle of Mortain are pretty accurate. The units that were involved, where they were located during the battle, the things that it was the 120th Infantry Regiment that my father was in, and they were on top of Mortain, the hill 314 in Mortain, and they held it for 6 days against constant German counterattacks. So that was pretty not as well researched. Obviously, don't claim to be a nonfiction writer, but it was pretty well researched and pretty accurate. The individual interaction between Pete and Alex and the things that they're individually doing, their conversations are obviously, all fictionalized. But
Yeah,
during the
it's always
course of that battle, Alex saves Pete, and then Pete, who is a medic, saves Alex when he becomes wounded. So all of that is fictionalized drama. But the setting and the actions for which my father won his Silver Star were real events.
amazing. Yeah, it's always interesting how authors kind of handle that. In one case, with either characters they make up and place in a historical setting, maybe family members that they know that they place in a historical setting, but there wouldn't necessarily be documents, or they have the ability to create a story. And then you have historical fiction where you take actual historical figures, and what you know about them are speeches they left, things that they had written. But how do you get into their mindset and create the character of them
Yeah.
too? So it's I always find historical fiction and historical nonfiction very, very but like narrative, very fascinating in how people kind of create characters out of it.
For my father, I knew my father. I knew how he would act under certain circumstances. For Alex, I had to create him in my mind, and just to mention, the book is written from their alternating perspectives. They're living the same life, but because of Alex being black and Pete being white, they have very different perspectives on things. So the book is told in alternating chapters. So to write the sections involving Alex, I had to really kind of create Alex as an individual in my mind, and that's a fictional creation, but then I had to be consistent with that character.
So one of the things that I've always been curious about with historical fiction like this is How is capturing the way people talk and how people interact with each other? And so I'm curious, did you end up doing any type of research, like in maybe just by reading memoirs from soldiers, or how did you kind of capture the way, the cadence, the slang, the speech patterns? Because you've got in World War II, of course, brought together, these two guys were fighting. They were both from South Carolina, but they were certainly fighting alongside people from other areas of the United States. So I'm just curious, did you do any kind of digging into primary sources in order to kind of capture the way people talk to each other in these situations?
To a small degree, yeah. I would say also a lot of that is just from growing up in the South. Certainly not during the World War II, but during the '60s, and but I also did some primary research, particularly in regards to the Battle of Mortain. There's a book written about my father's regiment, and it's called Saving the Breakout. And it's much more expansive. It's about all the different elements that were going on during that battle, but it's told from the perspective of the soldiers who were there. So from reading that book and some other research, but mainly from that book, I got a feel of the way soldiers talked and thought in that battle. The 120th Regiment was part of the Old Hickory Division, which was a division that had been formed initially from the National Guards of North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and I think Tennessee. So it was a very regional, it had been a very regional division, and even though they had replacements along the way from anywhere, it still was very much a Southern, bunch of Southern boys. And so I captured some of that, I hope, in the book, making fun of each other, if you're from Georgia, or arguing over who made the best moonshine and that kind of thing.
The important stuff, yeah.
The important stuff.
Exactly.
And also from my father to some degree. He was grown up in a rural North Carolina, and he had his own speech patterns and kind of the things that he said, and a lot of those things made their way into the book as well.
So obviously the battle itself, your father was there. No question why that would become kind of a centerpiece of the two characters coming together. How did you decide on the other specific events, the historical events that like bring them back together during the civil rights era, for example?
That section's almost entirely fictionalized. The timing of that and some of the surrounding. I grew up in Columbia. Columbia, South Carolina. We moved there in 1968. So it's set in the neighborhood that I knew, and a lot of the things that went on during that time. During that time, there was restaurants that wouldn't serve black people. There were still whites only and blacks only water fountains. My high school was segregated except for military kids who went there. But the other high schools in my district were all white, all black. And it wasn't until 1970 that they integrated all of those schools into one new big school. So I had my own experiences with segregation and civil rights movement, and the anti-war movement was, we were all interested in what was happening there, where we might end up. So that part of the book drew a lot on my own experiences, but putting Alex and Pete into that, that was, I had to find a way to do that. I made Alex, as you know from reading, they come back together because Alex is the head of the military police at Fort Jackson. He's risen through the ranks post-war, and Pete has become the medical, he's not a doctor, but he's the medical service corps director of the base hospital. So they kind of have come back together just through their military assignments, and then there's an event that happens where Alex is responsible for investigating a crime against Pete, and that's how they kind of overcome their hesitancy to kind of reconnect with each other.
Reading the book, that was an interesting transition where you've got the 100 pages or so on World War II, and then there's a chapter break after you already mentioned that Alex got wounded, so I'm not giving away any spoilers or anything. So he got wounded and shipped back, and then you kind of jumped ahead. There was a chapter break, and then suddenly we're 20 years later ish, 25-ish years later. And at that point, it turned the book kind of changed from what felt a lot like, and the reason I mentioned kind of memoirs about World War II is that really did feel a lot like a lot of the World War II memoirs that I've read. Mm-hmm. Things like I'm drawing a blank on the name. With the old team, or drawing a blank. But anyway, a couple of memoirs that I've read, it read a lot like that. And then suddenly, when we transition to the 60s, it almost turns into more like a mystery, like a whodunit kind of thing. So it was an interesting transition from one to the other with it just and so it. I was kind of wondering as I was reading it, I'm sure there were a lot of conscious decisions made there. Like you said, you wanted to put them into the civil rights movement, and that seemed like a good way. It worked, kind of jumping. But I was curious as I was reading it about what might have happened kind of during that 25-ish year jump, and what you were thinking. But it sounds like it was intentional because you wanted to put them into the civil rights era and the Vietnam era to kind of get a sense of how to kind of bring the story to a conclusion. But was there anything else going through your mind when you were thinking about how you jumped from the World War II to the Vietnam era?
Yeah, first of all, that's a great question, because I've had a couple of people ask me that and have made me retrospectively going, well, maybe I should have filled in all that blank time and turned it into something, but a bigger novel. But I knew that, Alex never came home from World War II, in reality. So I wanted, and Alex never was really truly a son to Pete's family. So I wanted Alex to go through a kind of a transition where he decides to become his own man. He's been the black boy living on the white farm or fighting in the white man's army his entire life. So I wanted him to experience, a transition where he becomes a bigger, stronger. He already is a big character and a strong man and a heroic warrior, but I wanted him to find himself as a black man. And to do that, he had to, I think, I felt like he had to break away from Pete and find his own life. And I'll tell you, the last chapter that I wrote in the book is the one where Alex is sent to the Margate Hospital in England, and he's treated poorly by the English nurses. He doesn't receive his Purple Heart. He doesn't receive the same medal that Pete receives. I wanted to create a stronger reason for Alex to say to hell with it, you know, I, I'm gonna navigate my own life from here on out. And I didn't feel like that transition was strong enough. So that actually was the very last chapter written, which was kind of inserted there to help clarify why Alex disappears for 20 years. And then I brought them back together as we talked about already.
Yeah, and from a fiction kind of a literary perspective, that makes a lot of sense, and I think it works fine. I'm not trying to say that it doesn't work. I think the just coming up from the historian's perspective, we're constantly trying to fill in the gaps, and so that's just kind of the way my mind operated, I think, while I was reading it. But I mean, the story is great. The story works great. I think the time jump makes sense in the context of the story because, like you said, you don't need to go through all of the backstory about how they established their lives and how they meet their wives, and I mean you've got enough flashbacks kind of in there to kind of fill in some of the gaps that we need there. But there probably is really no
there
need
is some
to.
historical relevance there, however, because I dug into this when I was kind of writing that chapter, and that's how Black soldiers in World War II were denied recognition for the things they did. There were, of the almost 500 Medal of Honor winners, there were no Black Medal of Honor winners, and that goes right on down through the lower tiers of medals. And in fact, Black soldiers almost always were denied the Purple Heart because of the way you had to be nominated. Someone had to write you up to get you a Purple Heart, and it had to be for a combat wound. And in World War II, for the Black soldiers, they were repeatedly described as having injuries, never wounds. So there was some systematic denial of recognition, despite many well-documented heroic actions by Black units or individual Black soldiers. So I wanted to bring that in too.
Yeah. And from that perspective, the two eras provide kind of a good bookends because, World War II, Black soldiers were not permitted to serve on the front lines. They were kind of reserved for behind the lines positions, motor pools, and all that, like in your story. Whereas in Vietnam, as you mentioned, they were very much on the front lines. In many cases, they were disproportionately represented on the front lines.
Yes.
And suffered wounds at a higher, suffered death and injuries, wounds in battle at a higher percentage than their population would. So it was, in that way, I thought that really did provide some nice kind of parallels and kind of a nice demonstration of the evolution, without getting too bogged down in all the various little steps along the way, but just kind of showing big picture, boom, big picture. I thought that worked very nicely. Sorry, Jimmy, I think I cut you off earlier.
Oh, no, it was because this is a fascinating topic and something that you had mentioned, connected back to what we were talking about earlier, where there's this historical research that's being done. Then there's kind of this character research that's being done, what Rob was asking you earlier about, like dialect and how you develop the personalities. So just wondering, so we have this historical research that you did around the Black experience in World War II, in Vietnam during the Civil Rights War. Was there any type of cultural research that you did at the same time? How did you capture or try to capture in an authentic way Alex's voice when you were writing his character? What did you have friends that you talked to and leaned into for just to get some perspective? Did you do research in different areas, read any type of other literature? Just wondering how you created this character, because you knew your father, but how did you create this other authentic character?
Yeah. in a couple of ways. One, there's a story in the book about Alex having to be the military police officer arresting, I think it was Captain Levi, who was a black doctor at Fort Jackson, who was he was insubordinate. He was against the war. He was a dermatologist, and he was refusing to train Green Berets about treatment of different parasite skin infections because he knew they were going to Laos and Cambodia and things like that. And he was, so I researched that story about Howard Levy, to kind of get a sense of what the attitude was among black soldiers on the military bases in the 1960s, late 60s. I also used the character of Jacob, who is Alex's son, who plays basketball. He's the only black player on the Densville High School basketball team. And the real Jacob was a friend of mine, and he was the only black player on our high school basketball team. And he took tremendous abuse. However, I used him as a counterpunch to who I thought Alex would be. Alex is a lifer in the military, in the military police. His belief is that the times are changing. As Martin Luther King said, the arc of moral justice is long but true, I guess. I don't remember the exact quote. He believes that things are moving in the right direction, and he's playing his part by being an accomplished, respected, proud black man raising a good family. Jacob is much more Stokely Carmichael than he is Martin Luther King. He believes in, Jacob's an angry boy who wants to burn it all down and can't believe his father is in the military, and is supportive of Vietnam, is supportive of the fact that the highest casualty rates in Vietnam are all the black soldiers. So their interactions, I think, kind of highlight my feeling for what must have been some of the tensions in the black community at the time, at least from what I saw and from what I read. Yeah, that's where that's how I developed their characters and how they interacted with each other, and tried to keep Alex true to that character in his other aspects of the book.
Yeah, it's interesting to put it that way because you're kind of using these characters as personifications of larger historical movements. And
absolutely, yes.
Yeah, so like you said, the Stokely Carmichaels versus the Martin Luther Kings, and then even going back further, back in the night, as you say, the book starts off in the 30s, and of course back then there would have been more of a discussion of the successors of Booker T. Washington versus W.B. Du Bois and the NAACP. And so you just had the one character going back then, so you didn't quite have the same personification. But it is an interesting way to tackle that because you're able to use these characters to inform the reader. You're actually introducing them to some pretty heavy historical concepts. You're just doing it in a kind of an accessible way through these fictional characters. And I thought that was fair. That was effective. And like you said, it's kind of an interesting way. You've got Alex and his son kind of representing the differences within the community. And then you've got, the white, like Pete, trying to make sense of it, and all the white people trying to make sense of it. So it's an interesting way to kind of demonstrate the different historical kind of movements and factions kind of at play in all of this?
I made Pete purposely. Pete is constantly surprised that Alex doesn't see things exactly as he does. If there's such a thing as somebody who's colorblind, it's Pete. And he just doesn't understand what, the life that Alex is, the trauma that Alex has experienced in his life. And he just kind of wants everything just to be okay. And that's a little bit how my father probably was. And I think there are a lot of people who are that way.
Yeah, that I think is
in the 60s. I guess they called them the silent majority.
That's kind of what I was thinking, is that this is probably the way a lot of, because there were a lot of white people in the 40s, 50s, and 60s who sure did kind of buy into the racial hierarchies and all of that of the past, but there was also growing over time a growing number of whites who did not. And so, but all these white people who did not experience what black people went through, it's hard for them to really understand what the problem is, because it's really easy. And I know that today it gets kind of lumped into things like white privilege and all of that. But, the idea that white people never had to go through this traumatic stuff. And so
Right.
Therefore, whites say they don't see color, and they say, can't we all just move on? Just get over the past and move on. But that's not possible. As you mentioned, I think at one point in the book, Alex still even into the 1960s and 70s, he still has nightmares of when he saw his family getting murdered back in the 1930s. And so it's not something you can just get up and just move on from. You can't. It's there, and it's always going to be there. And so you have to. So well-meaning white people can't really comprehend that or overcome that. It's going to take a lot more than just simply just saying, hey, can we just forget about it and just move on happily into the future?
Yeah, I agree with you. I wanted Pete's affection for Alex to be pure. He loved Alex, and but he also had and that's what carried him through. But he also at the same time had some naivete, and could not quite ever understand why Alex would want to pull away.
Yeah, sometimes it's that discrepancy between sympathy and empathy, right? Like you don't necessarily have to put yourself in somebody's shoes, and sometimes it's very difficult to do it, to really try to fully understand the full experience. And you never understand the full experience, but you might be able to get a sense of why, right? Whereas sympathy is a little bit, I don't want to say superficial, because being sympathetic to something is important, but it's the empathy that really dives deeper. So this idea that like, oh, I'm sympathetic to your plight, but can't we all just get over it and get along?
Yeah.
Versus I'm empathetic to what you went through. I can't even imagine what that would have been like, but let me listen to you and understand your story as best I can.
From even when they were children, and they have that episode when Pete follows Alex to the colored school. Pete can never understand why Alex can't have the same feelings for him that he has for Alex. Just doesn't see why it's different.
Yeah, so I definitely recommend everybody to check the book out. Now, you mentioned that you have something else, another project on the horizon. What's next?
Well, I had planned to go back. My first 3 books have the same character, the same doctor, Declan Murphy, who, until someone proves me different, is what I tell people, literature's only OBGYN action hero. So I was going to go back and write another Declan Murphy novel, those novels kind of follow him across time. But in doing the research for boys about my family, and I didn't really know a lot about my father's family because, as in the book, he became estranged from his father. I think I met my grandfather once when I was a kid. So I didn't know a lot about my grandfather. My grandmother was Edie Glidewell. And my dad was extremely close to his mother, not to his father. But in kind of learning about the family, and again, my wife's ancestry work here, she discovered this character named P.W. Glidewell, who was a very flamboyant lawyer in Winston-Salem, North Carolina during the 20s and 30s. In fact, it is said that he is the character on which the Andy Griffith Matlock character was based. None of your students will have any clue who either Andy Griffin is or Matlock is, but I think both of y'all probably know who he was.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So P.W. Glidewell became involved in a case of a woman named Alma Petty Garrett, who was a penniless, woman who supposedly killed her father with an axe. He was a abuser, a drunkard, a bad person, and something happened where she, most likely, kills him with an axe, buries him in the basement underneath the coal, and a year later, she's feeling bad about her soul, and she goes to a revival. She's very religious. She's going to a tent revival and confesses to the evangelist that she killed her father and asks for forgiveness. And he gives her forgiveness, I guess, but then he goes and turns her into the police. So she's arrested, and they have this very celebrated trial where Alma Garrett's killed, being tried for murder for killing her father with an axe and covering it up. And P.W. Glidewell decides he's going to take the case because he doesn't think the preacher should have turned her in, because they didn't have laws in North Carolina. Some states did, but they didn't have a law in North Carolina that said you can't, that it's protected, any conversations like that with a minister is protected. And he gets her off. And the trial went on for weeks. It's covered in the paper every day. So there's a tremendous amount of information about the trial. And again, Glidewell is very flamboyant. And I think there's a story there. I haven't figured out what I'm going to do with it. But I'm putting Dr. Murphy back on the back burner, I think, and I'm gonna my next book's gonna be about P.W. Glidewell and Alma Garrett and her axe.
I mean, with names like that, it writes itself. Those are character names if I've ever heard.
Yeah. Good names.
Yeah.
That's really good.
And Alma Garrett, to her credit, goes on and lives an exemplary life. She lives to be very old, and she moves to Columbia, South Carolina, and opens a nursing home for debilitated, people who can't take care of themselves anymore. And she spends her life taking care of people. She's, kind of, be a great epilogue.
If you said it, I apologize, maybe I missed it, but do we know why she killed her dad?
He would go away for months at a time and then just show back up. And again, he was a drunkard. So he was an abusive. He was he was assaulting Alma's mother.
Oh, okay.
He was assaulting the mother, sexually assaulting the mother, and Alma convinced him to stop
With the sharp end of an axe.
with the sharp end of an axe.
That'll do it. Yeah, I think you've got quite a story there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and a screenplay.
Yeah, right.
I don't know
And
how to write a
Netflix
screenplay,
documentary.
but I'd like to.
Well, that sounds really cool. Well, yeah, I hope that works out for you, and I look forward to just hopefully seeing it once you're done, because that sounds really good.
Yeah.
Well, I've decided. I've been spending a lot of time, promoting boys, but I've promised myself it'll be my New Year's resolution to get started on PW and Alma.
That's great. And so, are you still going to go the historical fiction route with that, or are you going to go more of a kind of a standard nonfiction route with that? Because it sounds like that one is much more well documented than Alex and Pete for boys, since there's so much newspaper material and all that. Are you thinking of going more nonfiction in that way, or are you still going to stick with a fictional account of it?
I think I don't know the direction that I'll go, whether Alma's the main character. I'm really thinking right now that because of the family connection that P.W. Glidewell is probably going to be the main character, but I feel pretty sure it'll be a historical fiction. I'll draw on the newspaper coverage and the other resources that I can find, but I believe it'll be fictionalized.
Okay. Well, great. Look us up when you're finished with that.
I will.
I'm excited
check
to read
that
this. Yeah.
Okay, well, I figured this might be a good time to. We've got a couple folks in the audience here, so I was going to see if anybody had any questions. Actually, to get us started, I'm curious, how does one get into the historical fiction game? Because, like I mentioned earlier, the vast majority of people that we have come talk to us are writing academic nonfiction. And so there's kind of a standard process where you go, book proposals to publishers and all of that. But and peer review and all that fun stuff. So I'm just curious, and it sounds like you kind of came to the fiction game after your first career started to wind down. So how did you get into the fiction publishing world?
First, I was extremely uninformed. I wrote my first novel, which was the Occam's Razor, and I started contacting, getting on the computer and contacting literary agents. The old movies where you put your manuscript in a box and mail it off to a publisher, that doesn't exist anymore. Everything goes through a literary agent, and literary agents, I can tell you, I spent probably almost 2 years, hundreds, and looking back on it, how I could have been so boneheaded to keep after it, I don't know, but I would send off, and they all have different requirements, but it involved writing a query letter, some of them would want small segments of the manuscript to look at. They all wanted something different, your biography. And I heard back from very few of them. And finally, somebody told me, he said, look, you're not, unless you're an internet sensation and you have, 1 million followers, they're not, none of these literary agents are going to be that interested, unless you have something really dramatic to share with them, which I guess I didn't. So they said, you need to find an independent publisher. And I said, well, how do I do that? Well, just go online and, tell them, Google medical fiction, independent publishers. So the best independent publishers in the Southeast or in Georgia or what, So I started looking at independent publishers, and I put together probably, I don't know how many, I probably sent out about 10, and the 10th one sent a letter back saying, yeah, they'd be interested in seeing the whole manuscript.
Fantastic.
It took me 2 months to do that after 2 years wasting my time with literary agents. From my medical work and writing medical papers, I always assumed I could write. I just didn't know if my stories would be of interest. One of the very few literary agents who ever sent me anything back. Literary agents are also the only people left in America who use postcards. They'll send you postcards saying thanks, but no thanks. But one guy sent me a note back saying, pretty good story, but you're the worst writer I've ever encountered.
Oh my God.
Oh boy.
And he or she, and you know what? That was my first book, and he or she was correct. I have no doubt that they were telling the truth. But I basically started looking at independent publishers, and I looked at independent publishers who had an interest in whatever the book was about, and you could find them, and it narrowed the pool down. And again, independent publishers can't do for you what Simon and Schuster or HarperCollins can do, but it was the professional help that I needed to get the book published.
And was it an extensive revision process for the writing?
Pretty much, yeah. That was something else that was new for me. With medical writing, you kind of write your paper and you read it and you go, that sounds good, and you send it off. I hated, with the early books, I hated to revise them, but over time I figured out slowly that every revision makes it better. And I think I could continue to I could take up boys right now and go through it again and make it even better. You finally have to find a place to call it quits, but every revision makes it better, and I've become much more comfortable with them than I used to be.
Yeah, it's the same academic writing. I mean, you could continue to write that thesis. You could just keep revising,
just keep doing
information. At some point, you just have to, this is what it is right now, right? And you can always go back to it and do a second edition later or whatever you want to do, add an additional chapters, but you've got to find that sweet spot where you can actually get it out there, because if you don't get it out there, nobody sees it. So
right. I will say that I have come to really enjoy, whether it's a sentence or a paragraph or a page, rewriting something and making it and looking at it and go, yeah, I like that better. Better choice of some of the jingoisms you mentioned earlier. Trying to come up with a better phrase, an older fashioned phrase for something. It's fun to me, it's fun to do that.
And then once you got your foot in the door with this one publisher, have you stuck with that publisher, or do you still kind of start from scratch each time you're I imagine with the series, with all the three books revolving around that one character, that I imagine they're probably staying with the same publisher, but did you start with a different publisher for the historical fiction works?
I did.
Okay.
More so because the publisher of the first three books basically said he was going to retire. He was getting tired of it and suggested I find somebody else. He would have published the next book if I'd pushed him on it, but so I found a new and much better publisher for boys.
It's interesting to think of the publisher as just one guy.
As best I could tell, the Kohler books that published boys, they've got editors, they got art people, they got assistants this and assistants that, and every one of them was great to work with and helpful. Moonshine Cove, which was the original publisher, it was Eugene. I never talked to anybody but Eugene.
So does the Kohler books, does that still fit your definition of an independent publisher, or is this would you consider this more of a non-independent?
They're much bigger publishing company, but I would still consider them an independent publisher.
It's still be the same process of reaching out to them, not through a literary agent, but just reaching out to them directly.
I reached out to them directly.
Okay. All right. Good to know. All right, great. You mentioned that they have, art directors and all that, and I will say that the cover is really striking, and it was interesting to see that you won the award for the cover on that. How did that process work?
That's pretty interesting because I thought what Kohler did was pretty smart. First of all, they had an art person. We had a lot of conversations about what the book was about, what thoughts I had for what the cover might be, and she asked me to come up with 5 different cover ideas and to make them all distinct, not all just little variations on the theme, which I did, and I could get pictures of other covers from other books, that I liked. There was a James Lee Burke novel that had a picture of I gave her about 5 or 6 different ideas for what the book cover might be. She came back to me with what she thought were the two. She worked up 2 different ones based on what I'd given her. One is the one that you see, and then there was another one that was, I don't remember. It was had more to do with the dairy farm. But after I said, yeah, both of those were both good, Kohler does what they call a poll, where they send both covers out to basically everybody, all their former authors, everybody they interact with, whoever they have connections with, and they ask people to vote on which cover they like best. And the one that you see was a 75-25 winner over the other cover. But what I thought was really smart about it was publicity. This is before the book's ever even released, and they're already getting people to invest in it by at least having a choice on what the cover looks like. So I thought that was a really smart idea. I never heard anybody else say that they have done that.
That's a great process.
Yeah.
All right. Well, it is, we are at the end of the hour, and so I think we can wrap things up here. So, Dr. Newman, thank you again so much for coming. This was a great conversation and a lot of fun.
Thank you for having me, and for whatever of your students will see this, good luck to them. And I think it's great that they're pursuing higher education and pursuing particularly history. It's the oldest saying in the world, but if you don't understand your history, you're kind of doomed to go there again.
Yeah, and with all the stuff that's going on in history and in the teaching of history and the study of history and government dictates about history, we'll see how that all plays out.
Revising history to suit your political purposes can't be a good thing, and I don't know how to resist it. I'm hoping one day that one of my books is banned. I think that would be really good for sales.
It's like a badge of honor right now, too.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. That'd be okay.
Yeah, you're in good company if that happens.
Yes.
When I was at Seton Hall, the Seton Hall radio station, or the diocese banned Billy Joel's "Only the Good Die Young" song from their radio station, and if you haven't seen it yet, it's really interesting if you like music, but there's a Billy Joel documentary, and a highlight in the documentary is when Seton Hall, they cover in the newspaper, Seton Hall bans Billy Joel's song. He says it's the greatest thing that ever happened to his career.
These days we don't think of Billy Joel as a big rebel rouser, but back in the day.
Yeah.
Oh, he was.
Was it that?
The Archdiocese of Newark was pretty mad at him.
Was it that one line, the Catholic girls start much too late, that really
Yep,
pushed them over the edge?
that pushed them over the edge. Other things don't seem to bother them that much, but they didn't like that.
They didn't like
Yeah.
that one. All right.
Well, thank you very much for having me on. It's been a pleasure talking with you guys.
Yeah,
Thank
thank
you so
you.
much.
And thank you all for listening. If you have any questions or comments about this podcast or any of our other podcasts, please write to workinghistorians@gmail.com. This episode appears on the Working Historians podcast feed, and you can subscribe to that feed on any podcast app, including Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Podbean, Amazon Music, Pandora, or whatever else you prefer. That way you won't miss any episodes, and you'll continue to hear about all the cool stuff that historians do with their lives. As always, this podcast does not represent the views of Southern New Hampshire University. For Roger Newman and Jimmy Fennessy, I'm Rob Denning. Be good to yourselves and each other.